I would just like to open up our keynote speech and invite Reshma Shetty, President, CAO, and co-founder of Gingko Bioworks. Please take the floor. You have 30 minutes, use as you like.
Thank you very much, Doug, for the kind invitation to be here today. I'm very much honored to be able to share a little bit about what we do at Gingko and why we are so excited about the bioeconomy. Could my slides be put up? So I wanted to share with you a little bit about why we are so interested and passionate about the bioeconomy at Gingko Bioworks. I think for all of us, we can appreciate, for those of you who are scientists and engineers in the audience, that there's really been major steps forward in terms of the tools we have for engineering biology in recent years. So we have a convergence of many new technologies and tools. I'll be talking about a few of them today. And then most recently, the advent of AI has really been a game changer for the bioeconomy in terms of unlocking our ability to design biology even better than we were able to before. And so together, it's really the convergence of these technologies that means that now is the time for policymakers and governments to really be thinking deeply about biotechnology and what it can do to power your bioeconomy. And that's really, these technologies and their advancements are really what's enabling a whole range of new solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems. Next slide. So several governments around the world have been thinking about and talking about biotechnology. These are just a few snapshots from recent reports and strategies and national roadmaps that have come out. So for example, thank you. The European Union has talked about how biotechnology and biomanufacturing is one of the most promising technological areas of this century. In the US, there's been a lot of reports coming out of the White House about the potential of the bioeconomy. They talk about how biotechnology, together with advances in computing, are making us poised for breakthroughs in everything from drug discovery to chemical and material manufacturing. China has actually been leading, I think, with respect to government policies and plans for the bioeconomy. And so in their 14th five-year plan, there's a major focus on the bioeconomy and its role in boosting high-quality development. And then finally, Japan has also talked about promoting biomanufacturing as a solution to global social challenges and sustainable economic growth. And so I think there's a wide recognition from countries around the world about just the role that biotechnology and by extension the bioeconomy can play in driving their nations forward. To give you a sense of kind of the type of economic impact we might be able to see from this sector going forward, this is an article from STAT around the biorevolution. And you can see they talk about how the biological revolution has the potential to be as transformative to business and economies as the digital revolution that preceded it. And creating value in every sector. Historically, people have usually associated biotechnology with health and medicine and thinking of it as simply a source of new cures for human diseases. But really, I think there's an opportunity for biotechnology to transform every sector of our economy. Next slide. There's been attempts to estimate the potential economic impact of the bioeconomy. You can see that an analysis was done looking at different use cases for how biotechnology might be transformative and its potential economic impact. And they're estimating here a direct economic impact of $2 trillion to $4 trillion in the next 10 to 20 years. And more than half of that is actually outside of health, right, in sectors like agriculture and textile manufacturing that the previous panel touched on. And so really, there's a potential for multiple sectors of the international economy to be transformed by biotechnology, which is, I think, why all of us are gathered here today. Next slide. So why should all of you as policymakers and government officials be really paying attention to biotechnology? I think there's an opportunity for biotechnology to play a role in addressing some of the most pressing problems that nations are facing today. So when we talk about how are we going to be able to meet our emissions reductions targets to mitigate climate change, when we think about resilient supply chains, I think something that has really come to the forefront since COVID-19, and how different world disruptions can really impact nations' access to food and medical supplies, to ensure food security for your nation, and to further reduce your reliance on fossil fuels. I think biotechnology has a role to play in addressing all of these different challenges. So you might be asking yourself, why now? Biotechnology has been around for a very long time. And the answer is really, again, about the convergence of many different tools and technologies. So when I was a PhD student in the 2000s, I spent a lot of my time doing work not so dissimilar from what these women were doing back in 1944, where I stood at the bench and I moved liquids around with a pipette, and that's how I did biotechnology research. It was state of the art. I was fortunate enough to be able to get my PhD at MIT, and so I was able to have access to some of the best resources in the world, but this is how biotechnology was done. And the fact is that when you are hand designing biological systems, it really just limits the scale and complexity of what you can do. And so really, if we're going to realize the full potential that biotechnology has to offer all of us, we really need to transform how we do biotechnology research in order to bring about the products that could have these huge multi-trillion-dollar impacts on the world. And so that's a lot of what we think about at Gingko, is how do we bring about that transformation in how we do biotechnology research. And there's really 4 main technologies that are coming together all at the same time to drive that transformation in biotechnology. The first is laboratory automation. The second is around DNA synthesis and gene editing tools like CRISPR that I'm sure many of you have heard of. The third is kind of genomic scale biological learning. And then the fourth is really AI, which is the most recent. But it's really the convergence of all these technologies that means that now is the time for countries to really embrace biotechnology as part of their national economic strategy. Next slide. Okay, so when it comes to laboratory automation, and forgive me a second, I'm going to nerd out a little bit with respect to why automation is just so critical. So as I said, when I did my PhD, I spent all of my time moving liquids around, and that was state-of-the-art biotechnology research. But it meant that the number of designs I could explore and the amount of data I could generate was fundamentally limited by the number of hours in the day, right? And so there's been a lot of interest and investment in automation to be able to scale that up. Scale up the number of designs you can explore, scale up the amount of data you can generate. And that's been a huge boon. But usually, one of the challenges with laboratory automation is that when you scale up, you end up also losing flexibility. So myself, at the bench, every day I can come in and design a new experiment from scratch, do whatever I need to do to get the experiment done. Automation, not always so flexible. Oftentimes you see companies investing in very rigid lockdown protocols to be able to generate the data they need in order to facilitate their biotechnology research. But in a world where now we want to be able to explore many, many different applications, where we need to be able to generate data to train our AI models, that rigidity doesn't really work anymore. You really want to be able to have the best of both worlds, flexibility and scale, to be able to generate the custom data sets, the training data sets you need for your AI models. And so at Gingko, we've really been investing in trying to break out of that flexibility versus scale paradigm and find a way forward where we can have both flexibility and scale. So we've been investing a lot in laboratory automation that is sort of plug and play, Lego, if you will, where you can basically combine different instruments in a reconfigurable fashion so that you can set up new workflows much faster than you could before, while still achieving the scale of data generation that's needed to be able to test, to train your AI models and then validate the generative AI results that come out of your models. And so I'm happy to talk about more about this at the break. Next slide. The next set of technologies that are kind of converging to enable the biotechnology revolution is really on both the DNA synthesis side and on the gene editing side. So with the advent of DNA synthesis, all of a sudden I no longer need physical access to genetic materials in order to be able to use those materials in a new biological design. I can just take the code that's come about from various international genome sequencing projects, I can synthesize that DNA in my lab just by having access to the digital A's, T's, G's, and C's. And I can then have that physical material and be able to go and engineer an organism or a cell line, test it in my own hands, and see how well it works. And so DNA synthesis has really been a huge leap forward in not only giving us access to what nature has provided us, but also then if you're starting to use AI models to be able to generate your designs, being able to generate those designs and then test how well they work in the lab. And so not only can we design de novo DNA, synthesize it, and test it out in the lab, but we can now, with the advent of CRISPR technologies, be able to actually put that DNA in almost any organism you want to a first approximation. And so that's really unlocked just the biological and genetic tool set we have for being able to engineer biology. So it's also been a second game changer for the biotechnology R&D. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. To give you a sense of how these technologies have been improving, and apologies for those of you in the audience who are well familiar with these trends. So that dotted line there is Moore's law. It's basically a measure of how much improvement there's been in semiconductor technologies. So the cost per transistor has dropped over many years, and we've all seen how our lives have been revolutionized by computing and the internet. The blue line here is the falling cost of DNA sequencing technologies. It's the cost to sequence a genome, roughly speaking. And so you can see it's actually done even better than Moore's law, had a precipitous drop in the cost to be able to generate new code from just reading out from the natural world. And then finally, the red line is the cost of DNA synthesis. It's also fallen, not quite as steeply as DNA sequencing. So writing is still a little bit more expensive than reading. But together, reading and writing DNA and the falling cost of those technologies have, again, been a major unlock for us in what we can do with biotechnology R&D. Now, I'll note that it's actually still not cheap enough. If you imagine this going down a few more orders of magnitude, it would further unlock our ability to really be able to engineer biology at scale. But the trends are moving in the right direction. So again, it's about this convergence of multiple technology trends all together at this time that we live in today. Next slide. Okay, so then the final and fourth technology that I think is really underpinning the biotechnology revolution is really AI. And this has really come about and really been a game changer in the last few years with the advent of generative AI and large language models. This is a quote from Jensen Huang. He's the CEO of NVIDIA. For any of you who pay attention to AI, NVIDIA is one of the companies that's building the chips that are actually powering a lot of the AI revolution. And recently, Jensen Huang gave a talk where he talked about how the next amazing revolution is going to come. Where is it going to come from? And he thinks this is going to be the flat-out biggest one yet. There's no question that it's going to be digital biology. By that, he means synthetic biology, right? So this is the CEO of one of the most prominent technology companies there is that's underpinning the AI revolution. And he is telling you that the most important thing to happen in the next century is going to be synthetic biology, right? I think it speaks to a broad recognition across sectors that there's just potential for all of these various technologies, whether it's laboratory automation, DNA synthesis and gene editing, our ability to generate data at scale, and now AI coming together to power. And that's why the time is now to be thinking about the bioeconomy. Next slide. Interestingly, these same trends have also been picked up by governments. So in particular, the United States White House put out an executive order on AI. And there's a lot of interest in AI in the U.S. at the moment, and one of the, as there is in other countries as well. And one of the interesting things is in that executive order for AI, they talked about how if you build an AI model that has been trained using more than a computing power of 10 to the 26th integer or floating point operations, they want you to come talk to them. They're interested in the impact that might have, both from an economic perspective, but also from a security perspective. Now, what's even more interesting is that if you continue reading that executive order from the White House, they say if you build a model that was trained primarily on biological sequence data and used a quantity of computing power greater than 10 to the 23rd integer or floating point operations, they also want you to come talk to them. It's actually a lower threshold for AI models that were trained on biological sequence data relative to AI models that were trained on human language. And that's reflecting, again, the White House's appreciation that the intersection of AI and biology could really be a game changer, both from an economic perspective, but candidly also from a security perspective. Next slide. So what is the real limiter when it comes to taking advantage of AI for biotechnology? And I would argue that today we are limited not by the AI models themselves, but really by the data we have to train these AI models, right? And that's really what's going to be the big unlock for us. So if you just think about kind of how biology works, biology is digital code, right? It's A's, T's, G's, and C's. But there's still a lot of that digital code that we either haven't read yet because we haven't had sequencing projects to sequence large swaths of the natural world. So there's a lot more training data out there available than we have access to at the moment in the natural world. But then that digital code then gets translated into first RNA and then protein sequences. But the reality is there's still a lot of genes for which we don't understand the function. And so we can, while we have access to the genomes to be able to train our DNA models, being able to take the next step and use it for functional design is limited. As an example, several years ago, researchers at the J. Craig Venter Institute built what they called a synthetic minimal cell. So it was intended to be a very simple engineered organism. It had, roughly speaking, about 500 genes. So even in this most simplest life form that was human designed, about 20% of the genes were of unknown function. So again, if we can use laboratory automation, DNA synthesis, gene editing to really access yet even more data to train our AI models, I think the potential is enormous. If you keep moving across this, then if you think about protein folding and then actually understanding the true phenotype of those biological systems, you know, is this protein secreted or not? What function does it have? What substrates does it work on? You know, these are all data sets that are quite limited. And so being able to have data engines to generate the data that we need to train our AI models is instrumental to really realizing the full impact of biotechnology on our economies. Next slide. So to give you a little bit of background on Gingko, Gingko is a platform company. Our customers, our partners, typically outsource biotechnology R&D to us. We serve to kind of operate as an extension of their own in-house groups, or if they don't have an in-house R&D group, we can be that R&D team for them. And so we're publicly traded, we're listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and our goal is really to be able to make biology easier to engineer, be able to power the product development pipelines for companies across a range of sectors. Next slide. And so the way we do that is by taking advantage of all of these technology trends that I just talked to you about. So we combine kind of state-of-the-art flexible laboratory automation with a bunch of data assets that we've collected ourselves and via acquisition over time with access to computing power. So we have a $250 million partnership with Google in order to be able to access the compute power to build our own foundation models and then leverage our foundry, that flexible automation, to generate the data to actually train those models. And so all of these together, again, are about taking advantage of those technological trends to be able to bring biotechnology R&D to more and more customers and power their own product development pipelines. To be clear, we don't develop any products ourselves. We're really a platform for enabling the entire industry. And you'll hear from a couple different Gingko customers later today. So next slide. So why do companies outsource to Gingko? It's really about being able to power their own internal R&D. So being able to generate more data per R&D dollar, being able to access capabilities they might not have in-house, and being able to candidly save money, be able to basically reduce their R&D budgets while having an even bigger impact than they might be able to have alone. Next slide. We work with companies across a lot of sectors, and again, this is a reflection of how biotechnology can power and impact a lot of different economic sectors. So again, obviously we work with pharma and helping to develop their genomic medicines, but also have a long history of working in the industrial biotechnology space, in food and in chemical production. And then finally, have also been working in agriculture. And I think in agriculture in particular, there's a huge potential to impact both food security as well as thinking about reducing the environmental footprint of how we grow our food in order to ultimately have an impact on emissions reduction. Next slide. And so we really try to offer state-of-the-art capabilities to our partners. So for example, here on the left is the number of genes available from UniProt. It's kind of one of the major publicly available sequence databases. We have internally been amassing access to a lot of different strain collections and sequence databases in order to be able to offer that to anybody who wants to work with us. And so we have about 2.7 billion genes or so at this point. We've just recently added even more on top of that. And so this is about providing companies access to the data sets that they need to be able to train their AI models and ultimately develop better biotechnology products. We also have access to a lot of compute. So if you want to develop an AI model, we can give you access to not only the data you need to do so, but also the computing power you need to do so. Next slide. One of the things that I think is really important for policymakers and officials to know is that it's not just about the R&D piece, right? You also then need to be able to manufacture those products at scale. And so biomanufacturing capacity, in my view, is something that countries should be thinking about as a national asset, right? If you want to be able to secure your supply chains, if you want to be able to take advantage of the bioeconomy to power your own economy, having access to domestic biomanufacturing capacity is really essential infrastructure that underpins the bioeconomy. I think one of the challenges is that historically, a lot of the biomanufacturing facilities that have been built either through private companies or through publicly funded efforts have been purpose-built, built for making a single product. I think really to enable biotechnology more broadly, governments in particular should really focus on investing in multi-product facilities. Facilities that in the middle of a global pandemic, you can point at vaccine manufacturing. But outside of a global pandemic, you can provide to the SMEs and large businesses to be able to manufacture the products that they need or help scale up the products they need. And so that focus on building flexible biomanufacturing capacity domestically is, I think, a critical one. It's a challenging one, to be clear. The downstream purification needs for different products can vary, and so it does require a lot of forethought and planning into how to design true multi-product facilities that can really enable not just one company, but really a constellation of companies to survive and thrive. But I think it's a worthwhile thing for policymakers to be thinking about. Next slide. And then finally, I would be kind of remiss in not closing by saying that I think COVID-19 reminded all of us about kind of both the power of biology, but also our ability to take advantage of biotechnology to respond to global pandemics like this. We have to really think about and not only how do we grow our bioeconomy, but how do we secure it? How do we think about biosecurity in general? And if you go to the next slide. What I would like to say about biosecurity is that I think it's really important to be thinking about it early on and in conjunction with how you build your bioeconomy. And so whether a particular biological threat comes from nature itself, from laboratory accidents, or through intentional generation of biological weapons, I really think there's two sides that every government needs to be thinking about and every policymaker needs to be thinking about when it comes to biosecurity. First is on detection and attribution. So how do we put in place the appropriate networks to be able to monitor for emerging biological threats? And I think one of the big advantages that we can take away from the pandemic is that we actually really learned what technologies work and what technologies don't when it comes to being able to detect the emergence and spread of an infectious disease. We should not lose those lessons and really build in place the biosecurity infrastructure we need to be able to detect emerging biological threats and even attribute them before they start spreading. And then finally, I think the pandemic also showed us just what is possible in terms of rapid response to emerging biological threats, and that if the world comes together, we can, in fact, develop vaccines and therapeutics at really quite a remarkable pace. And so, again, putting in place the infrastructure to be able to respond even quicker to the next biological threat, together this ability to detect biological threats and ability to rapidly respond to biological threats means that whether a threat is natural from laboratory accidents or from intentional release, we can both respond quickly to mitigate any impact on the world, but also deter any of those types of incidents from happening in the future. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions we might have in the 5 minutes remaining.
Oh, okay, I'm going to have to use that one. Okay. Sorry, my mic isn't working. We're a little bit late, but it'll be a shame not to take a question or two. So I'm going to see if any 2 questions, we can take 2 questions from the audience, and you can answer how you will. Does anybody have a question for Reshma? Nope, not yet. There we go, there's one in the mic. Could you pass the mic? And any other question from the audience? We can take 2. I have one, but I can ask you in lunchtime. Okay. Thank you.
My question is quite simple. It's just, what's the future of Gingko in terms of automation? Do you plan to, in a few decades, to have everything automated, like from even the decision process, like from the expert or using AI? How are you working on integrate all these tools?
It's a great question. I hope it will be shorter than a few decades, but yeah, our goal would be to significantly automate like most of the laboratory work that we do. We're not there yet, but I think we're on a path to that. However, I also do think that AI tools will be core to the design of biological systems. But what we've seen historically is every time we automate something, every time we make the design of a particular piece of DNA easier, there's always a new frontier of biological complexity that the tools can't address. And so that new frontier is where it's still important to have really amazing scientists and engineers being able to push the technologies even further to hit that new frontier. So to me, what we're simply doing is expanding the envelope of what's possible. And so, ideas and dreams that you wouldn't even think about tackling today will suddenly open up to us as the tools and automation advance.
Thanks very much for the talk. How does Gingko Bioworks want to be governed? Because the governance is one of the main topic of this conference here today.
Yeah, it's a great question. We're strong proponents of good governance and good regulation when it comes to biotechnology products. I think that's quite important. From my perspective, the worst thing that can happen with respect to biotechnology products is uncertainty in regulation. If the path forward is uncertain from a regulatory perspective, that actually inhibits investment even from the beginning. You don't even invest in the research area because you don't know if you have a path forward in terms of how you would even test it, let alone bring it to market. And so clarity in regulation is actually probably the first and foremost most important thing with respect to biotechnology products. I would say the second thing is, at least in the US, we tend to, at least from a legislative perspective, regulate products based on their end use. So if it's a food, we look at certain things. If it's a drug, we look at certain things. If it's a cosmetic, we look at certain things. We're not, legislatively speaking, supposed to regulate based on the method of manufacture. However, in practice, most US agencies do in fact look at the method of manufacture to govern how they regulate things. Candidly, from a scientific perspective, I'm not sure that's wise because the method by which you make something may or may not have an impact on the ultimate safety of the product. And so I think there's some advances we can do with respect to having more product-focused regulation rather than process-focused regulation as well.
Hi. So aside from the regulatory question, you're at the OECD, which specializes in public policy. Mm-hmm. Are there any ideas that you would want to bring to policymakers to help push forward the kind of revolution that you see as possible?
Yeah, I think the place where I think policymakers really have a role to play is in biosecurity, candidly speaking. Private companies are not going to invest in biosecurity infrastructure. That's something that only governments can do. And so a recognition about the importance of putting in place biosecurity, whether it's on the monitoring side, being able to detect emerging biological threats, or on the rapid response side. I think the days of having national stockpiles to respond to an individual biological threat are candidly dated. We need to be able to rapidly respond and scale up manufacturing in response to whatever threat happens to emerge. So we just need totally different paradigms for how we think about biosecurity going forward. And I really think that can only be done kind of first at the policy level, but then ultimately by individual governments investing in the biosecurity infrastructure. That won't be carried by companies.
So I'd like to thank once again Reshma Shetty for her intervention. Thanks, and we'll have to talk at lunchtime if you have.